Right.
The recording has started.
Thank you.
Okay, are we ready to make a start then, Lisa?
Yeah, go right ahead. There.
Okay, all right then. So, okay, for me to give an introduction.
I'm ready.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay. So I'd just like to welcome everybody tonight to our meeting, the CQI Wales and Urca branch. We give you a warm welcome and I hope you've had a pleasant day. I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. We have Carl Mozak, who is facilitating for us tonight, supported by Gavin Owen from the Quality Foundation facilitator. I'm the Wales chair of the CQI and the IRCA, and this is an online event and being recorded. There will be CPD points awarded. Please contact our secretary, Carl. He's our branch secretary for Wales, about any CPD details. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Peter Grossi. He has a long history of lectures for us in the CQI Wales branch. And this talk tonight is a second one in the series on AI. Peter is going to give us a brief summarized talk about what he did last time, and then he's going to lead us into some new material tonight on AI architecture and see how it fits in, how AI fits in with our lives today. So really, that's all I've got to say. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Peter Grossi.
Well, thank you, Derek, and good evening, everybody. I owe you an apology because I've just realized that I seem to have a small teddy bear growing out of the top of my head. I asked it to move and it refused, so I'm afraid it's going to have to stay there. Fine, let me move on now. I want to start just by saying what makes AI so special. Why is it so different from what we've been doing before? Whose bright idea is it? And just briefly, without getting too technical, how it works and how it's made. Then there's quite a lot on training, because these things aren't programmed, they're trained. So it's as well we understand how, because that indicates what they can do and what problems you might have with them. The importance of gaming, because gaming throughout computer history has been used as a yardstick, as a measure of computer intelligence. There is an elephant in the room, which is an inherent problem, which I shall talk about, and then generally failure modes. I had planned on spending a few minutes on generative AI, but I think it would be best if, because there's so much going on in the news at the moment, with legal issues as well as technical issues, that I keep that, because I think there's plenty for me to talk about this evening, and we'll save the generative AI perhaps for a future occasion. Then the AI foundation model, which is the way AI is now being sold, which is interesting because this is the sort of thing we will come across. And then a brief review of AI as used in the UK. So what's so special about it? Well, conventional computer systems only do exactly what the programmers tell them, which means you need to know exactly what you want them to do. You need to know exactly how you want them to do it. And generally speaking, you are asking them to produce a definitive answer for something, like company accounts or something like that. But AI systems don't work that way at all. AI systems learn for themselves. They discover patterns. You present patterns to them, and they make sense of them, and they'll recognize patterns. And they're very creative, so they can find patterns in data that human experts haven't spotted. So they're well suited for problems for which definitive answers aren't possible. but they're not very well suited or very efficient at deterministic tasks like, routine accounting and things like that. So both styles of computing will continue to evolve independently and working with each other. The reason why it's so important is that our lives are governed by patterns. So faces and voices, speech, obviously, medical diagnosis, all these things, even weather, so we know whether we need an umbrella in Wales, which more often than not we do. And of course, maps and navigation for travelers. So the problem then, let's have a look. Recognizing faces, for example, it requires far more than just simply comparing images pixel by pixel, because when you recognize someone's face, they're not necessarily presented at the same angle as you saw them before. The lighting might be different. They might have a different expression, and yet we still recognize them. So conventional programming, which just compares an image pixel by pixel, would not be very good at recognizing people from, let's say, you have a security camera. How will it recognize someone approaching from the image that you've got on, that you took them for HR department reference? They're different angles and so forth. So conventional programming is very limited and a new approach entirely is required. This has been brewing for about 150 years. In about 1873, forensic biologists discovered that the human brain has a lot of nodules which are connected with tiny electrosensitive fibers. And there didn't seem to be any other structures in the brain. So the question arose, how on earth can this mat of fibers and nodules actually account for everything we know and everything we feel, everything we experience? Recent estimates show that there are about 86 billion neurons in the brain, and each one of them is connected to through about 7,000 dendrites to other neurons. So if you sort of add up, if you say that each of those neurons has a tiny little electrochemical memory in it, then you can imagine that there are a very considerable capacity to remember things. The other interesting thing about this is that we learn as we go. We don't have to walk down to the person shop every now and again and get something plugged in which updates our memory and our programming. So not only do we change our memory, we seem to change our programming. A decision we make today may be different from the decision we made yesterday, ostensibly under the same conditions. But between then and now, we've perhaps learned something or seen something or experienced something, and our answer to the same question might be subtly different. So we are continually learning. We do it whether we want to or not. It's just the nature of who we are. So this adds a whole new dimension, that we have this thing which is not only a memory, but it seems to be capable of changing its programming all the time. So that became a challenge. By about 1988, researchers finally had sufficient computing power, because that was about the time when personal computers came on the market, and of course mainframe computers, as they were then known, had developed a lot. So researchers had sufficient computing power to actually experiment with some mathematical conundrums. And they were able to produce, within a couple of years, they were able to produce small networks which actually simulated a very basic learning capability. And this is more or less when I got involved. There was a seminal book published, and it just basically explained the broad principles, but you couldn't do very much with it. by 2000, a couple of years later, someone had managed to develop a network that could recognize handwriting. Now, handwriting isn't that easy because you can't just sort of compare like a picture of a reference letter with someone's handwriting because everything's different. Loops that are supposed to be joined up aren't always joined up. Straight lines aren't necessarily straight or at the right angle, and yet we somehow still recognize them, unless they're written by a doctor, of course. So, you know, there's a tremendous variety. Every single letter can be written so many different ways by different people. So to perform handwriting recognition was really quite a significant achievement. Since then, of course, computers have got more powerful, and as they've got more powerful, the software has been written more efficiently. They've been able to cope with much bigger problems. But basically, having taken over 120 years to get started, during the last, well, 25 years, the capability has absolutely exploded. So let's have a quick look and see what's inside, what's under the bonnet. The heart of an AI system is an artificial neural network, otherwise known as a neural net or neural network. And it's based on the physical model that the forensic scientists originally discovered. So on the right, there's a diagram there, and each of those disks represents what might be a neuron in the brain, and each of the arrows represents a dendrite or electrochemical connection from one neuron to another. But they're called perceptrons. So they're not electrochemical, they are simulated in software. And all that happens is that an input comes in to what's the first layer. That's on the left column, they call that the first layer. Then you get the intermediate layers, and you can see how everything cross connects. And then they end up into a set of output layers. And each of those disks or perceptrons has a little memory that regulates what it does with its inputs. So that doesn't remember the data, but it remembers what to do with the data. And that's the fundamental difference between this and conventional programming. With conventional programming, what to do with the data is built into the program, and it doesn't change when you run it, only changes when you update it. But with a neural net, what actually controls what it does with the data constantly varies according to what data you're giving it, which is in principle very similar to the sort of thing that our own brains do. Clearly, to do something which is complicated, you need a lot of memory, and therefore you need a rather bigger network than the one that I've shown there. So how do you program it? Well, you don't program it, you teach it. So supervised reinforcement learning is the first basic level of teaching these things. And what you do is you feed a pattern onto the input, and you have a look and see what it produces on the output. Now, to begin with, when it's just been born, as it were, the output will be completely random. You then compare it with what it ought to be, and there's a process, which I won't go into, it gets a bit complicated, but there's a process whereby if you get an error, it goes back in and it changes the numbers in those perceptrons. So the next time it sees any data, it does something slightly different with it. And then you present each of your patterns in turn. So if you're teaching it to recognize a handwriting, for example, of letters, then you would feed it a letter A. If it didn't guess the letter A correctly, you would just feed back a correction. And then you try it with the letter B. And again, feedback a correction if it guessed incorrectly, and so on. And then when you get to the end of the alphabet, you go back and do it again. Because each time, do you remember learning the times table? That you'd remember part of the times table, and then by the time you got to the end, you'd forgotten half the beginning again. So you had to go and start all. Do you remember? And so this has exactly the same problem, that each time you correct it to get something right, that's changed everything inside it, and it might then get what it learned earlier wrong. And you keep on going, and the way it works is very clever because it does eventually converge, and in the end it gets it all right. So that's called supervised reinforcement learning. Now I'm going to go on to other forms of learning later, which are really very important, and they're not dissimilar to the way we learn as well. So how's it made? Well, it's made using standard silicon digital architecture on what you might call an ordinary computer. But of course, for large applications, they call them deep learning, by the way, where you've got a very, very large number of these perceptrons because you're dealing with very large and complicated data patterns. So for large applications, you have enhanced hardware, sort of additional plug-in modules. And I'll be talking about those because they're a bit interesting as well. But it's essentially silicon-based digital computing. But there are research programs underway which are looking into molecular science and nanotechnology. And their objective is to be able to produce these neural networks, which, because they'll be sort of compact, rather than made of normal logical components, they'll be a lot faster, more power efficient, and more compact. But that hasn't happened yet. But there's a lot of energy being spent on doing that, and we can look forward to that in future. Now let's go back a step. In parallel with the development of the AI, the neural network concept and the way it works, do you remember when personal computers came out in the 1980s and they had very crude screens, just monochrome, maybe, what's it, 640 by 480 characters. So there weren't that really many dots for the computer to worry about whether they were on or off, and they didn't have color. So the processor didn't really have a tremendous amount of work to do, keeping that screen up to date with the things it wanted you to see. But then gaming came on, and you got the arcade games, and then people wanted to play arcade games at home, and they wanted better definition, they wanted color, and they wanted speed of response as well. So when they pressed this imaginary trigger, something would get shot on the screen very quickly, and they could dodge out of the way of incoming as well. So gamers were prepared to spend a lot of money on cards to plug into their machines, which will give them this. And of course, money powers engineering development. So certain companies, and notably MSI, name may be familiar, NVIDIA, they developed special cards that you could plug into your desktop computer, and it would give you these high resolution screen facilities. Now the way they work is that they're able to process simple arithmetic on a massive scale. So inside a graphical processor unit or GPU, there are loads and loads of small arithmetic units which process in parallel. So if we fast forward to 2000, neural nets started becoming bigger. To begin with, in about 2000, people have maybe 1,000 perceptrons in their neural net. And there's not an awful lot you can do with that, well, compared with what we're seeing now. But then someone had a bright idea and said, well, if you plug in a graphical processor unit into your machine, but instead of using it to process graphics, you use it to process perceptrons, which are basically just little arithmetic units. And all of a sudden, you've got millions of them, which are all running in parallel, taking the workload off your main computer. And I've shown that more or less in the diagram there. And that absolutely transformed the amount of the power available for the processing of neural nets. So if we fast forward now to 2020, with the help of these graphical processing units, a company called OpenAI developed what they called a generative pre-trained transformer, which is quite a mouthful. They called it GPT, which is a little bit easier to say. And by 2020, they had version 3. That was able to read and generate sensible looking text. It could understand text by context, and it could generate sensible looking phrases to answer questions. And that had 44 million perceptrons. That is one big step from the 1,000 that was the limit only a few years earlier. And that transformation happened because of the use of graphical processor units and other special processors they had. So this OpenAI project, the GPT-3, was not just an ordinary out-of-the-box business computer. It was quite heavily extended, if you like. That was in June of 20. By December, 5 months later, the number of perceptrons they had in their network was 1.5 trillion, arranged over 96 layers. Another company called Google, which we tend to know as a search engine, Google is heavily involved in the development of artificial intelligence systems, and I'll be talking a little bit about the way they're doing it and sort of thing they do. But DeepMind is one of Google's projects, which is basically a commercial provider of various forms of artificial intelligence. So now let me talk a little bit more about training, because that's at the heart of what these systems can and can't do. The problem with supervised reinforcement learning is that someone has to prepare all the data and tag it so the system knows what answers it's supposed to get for each data pattern, and therefore can generate a self-correcting process. And that takes time. And if you've got a very, very large data domain, people just cannot cope with the number of samples that the system is going to need to learn what it needs to do. So if you have a situation where the computer can work out for itself whether it's getting the right answer, you only need to feed it the raw data and let it chew on it all on its own and detect its own errors and feed back its own corrections. And you can just let that go for as many samples as you can find, and it saves an awful lot of time and energy in human beings having to tag each one. A very good example of how this works is with games. Now, I imagine many of you are at least broadly familiar with the game of chess, even if you're not a great player. But you know that the game of chess has certain pattern of allowable moves, and it has a defined endpoint called a checkmate. So you can train the computer to recognize whether it's got the right result by whether it's won the game. So what you can do is to take a number of games, show them to the computer and tell it what the result was, and then you can let it sort itself out after that. And the same with the game of Go, because I'm going to talk a little bit more about both of those. Another thing, I saw this only not very long ago. There was something on the television which showed in a laboratory a picture of a robot, an android robot, in a heap on the floor, and they turned it on, and the thing wriggled and struggled and wriggled and eventually just stood itself up. And basically all they'd done was to tell it that the higher you can get your head, the better it is. And just like a baby, when it learns, you don't say a baby, you move your leg this way, you move your leg that way. You'll find a baby will find its own way to its feet, and it will do it by wriggling this way and that way, and then staggering around and falling over, and then trying again, and so forth. So this self-learning was really quite spectacularly illustrated by this program, by this machine, that without having to tell it what to do, all they had to tell it was get this end result, and it wriggled and struggled and just stood up. Absolutely remarkable. So the thing about this is nobody had to spend time explaining it all, working out all the algebra and trigonometry of the different angles of the limbs. It just sorted itself out. Another important method of training these things is through imitation learning. Some projects are so big that it really is not possible to train them on a sufficiently large variety of samples. The game of Go is a particular example, but I'm going to get onto that. So what you need to do is to shortcut it. And just like we have rules of thumb, and people say, you know, you're in a job that might have lots of complications, and you say, well, you can make it a bit easier because if this sort of situation arises, it's safe to do this. You don't have to think it through too much. And that can take a lot of time consuming and thinking and delays away from the sort of complex problems that we sometimes have to deal with, that you can just use like a rule of thumb, which generally looks after you pretty well. And the same principle applies to training AI systems that, for example, in chess, when people learn to play chess, you can try to analyze and say, right, well, if I make this move, what could the opponent do? And if the opponent does that, what could I do in response? And then go on. And you'd never do it. There are so many combinations that you would never work your way through it. So what people do when they're learning chess is to go through books of standard openings. So if your opponent makes a first move of a particular sort, you know what the best first move is for you, or at least several alternatives according to your style of play. And then in response to that, they will do the same. And you find the first half dozen moves are straight out of a textbook somewhere. Now, there are hundreds of these, of course. But I just want to illustrate this, how this works. Because if you see on the left, I've got a network with 6 interdependent processes. Each one has an influence on the other 5, and it's bidirectional. Yep. So, you know, A can influence B, and on another occasion, B could influence A. So that's sort of 5 times 6. That's 30 possible interactions there. But if you split that up into 2 groups of 3, each of the processes only has to deal with 2 others. So you've only got 6 interactions in each group. So if you say 2 groups of 6, that's 12, add a bidirectional interaction between the group, you've now only got 4 interactions to complicate things. You've simplified the problem considerably. And that is one of the techniques which is used in training artificial networks to deal with really, really large problems. Another method of training, okay, you see, so far, everything I've talked about is not unlike the way we learn, really, in basic principle, even though the mechanics of it are different. So there is also what they call unsupervised learning. You've got to start with a system that broadly knows what it's supposed to be doing, or what game it's playing. But instead of being given data, it's left to generate random input patterns for itself. And it can decide whether they're good patterns or bad patterns, and see what results after using them. So it can explore so many more variations than people would have time to tell it about. So in competitive situations, such as games, but also maybe military command systems, you can play one system against another, and they can each fight it out. And when one of them loses, it will learn from those losses and get better. And then when they play the next time, the game will look different, and so on. So each one effectively acts as a step ladder for the other one. If you got a machine that you want to use for a military command, you have two of them, and with a scenario, and then ask each of them to get the best result. And they will maybe come up with a plan that no human being would have thought of. And that is not an exaggeration, because that has actually happened. Finally, multi-agent learning. Incidentally, that process I've just talked about is not dissimilar to the processes human beings use. If you want to learn to play chess well, the best way of learning it is to play someone else. And you learn from your mistakes when you lose. And if they're a lot better player than you, then your playing standard increases really quite rapidly. So two people playing chess will learn far more quickly than each one learning on their own. And so that works exactly the same with AI. The last one is multi-agent learning. And the example I've chosen is with the prospect of self-driving cars. Here, the cars have all sorts of sensors. They've got onboard sensors like cameras and so forth, but also they've got roadside digital sources, which are telling them about maybe roadworks and restrictions and speed limits. Bearing in mind, these can't necessarily read and understand signs. So, you know, they might need to have either get it from GPS for speed limits or from roadside, you know, transmitters of some sort, but also from neighboring vehicles and broadcast information services, which could give information about, you know, road traffic situations and weather. But these sources may conflict. One sensor might say it's safe to proceed. Another one might say, no, can't see that. One sensor might say there's nothing in the road ahead. Another might say, well, there's a pedestrian on the pavement which is about to jump out in front of you. So you have each of these sensors has its own little AI system, which is interpreting what it sees in terms of a danger or opportunity. But all these have to feed into a sort of command and control level, which is another AI system, which takes all these things and arbitrates and decides what to actually do about it. So here you have a whole new level of complexity. You've got AI systems dealing with individual, shall we say, sensors and information, and then another AI system sitting on top, deciding what to actually do about it. So there, you would be pleased to know, we get to the end of how we teach AI systems. There's quite a few tricks and techniques in there, and none of them are particularly unlike the way we learn as human beings, really. So let's play some games. As far back even as the 1970s, I remember that programmers used to spend some of their time using their computers at work to play games on. And they were programming the machines basically as playing surfaces. So you could play chess on a computer screen, but you would tell it to move the pieces. Or it would generate random numbers, so you could play card games and things like that. But for a computer to actually make decisions and compete as a competitor, it's a very different problem. Now, if you take simple games such as drafts, it is conceivable that you can work out what your best move is by saying, well, if I do this, my opponent could do this, this, or this. And if they do that, I can do this. And you can work through like a decision tree, and you can make a move that doesn't necessarily result in your losing the game. And that can be done using current programs, and have been done using current programming techniques. And it's basically using what's called deterministic methods. In other words, there is a right answer. But it's known as brute force. where you consider every possibility and chew over them. But you can only do that with fairly simple games. Card games can be played on probabilities. And again, using probability theory, you can play card games using computers. And they don't really require artificial intelligence, because they can be programmed to a competitive level by normal means. So computer intelligence, as you might want to call it, requires something rather more, something that can handle so many variations you can't actually use brute force to think them all through. And the first example that I want to talk about, oh well, there are two. I want to talk about the game of chess and the game of Go. The first major milestone in computer intelligence was in 1997 with a game of chess, when for the first time a computer actually beat the world champion, that was then Garry Kasparov. Then the second major milestone was 2016 with a game of Go, and that was a very different problem, which I shall explain, and that's why it took so long. And the third again was only last year in another game of Go, and this carried a very different significance. And I just want to explain a little bit about why those are so important. If we take the chess one first, it's a well-known game. It's played on an 8x8 board, but a game is reckoned to have an average of 40 moves from end to end, and an average of 30 moves, of 30 choices or options per move. If you multiply that lot up, you end up with a total number of playing options in a typical game of 10 to the power 60. Now that you cannot even conceive predefining all those different options and saying, well, if that situation arises, this is your best move. You can't even begin to do it by brute force. So for a computer to play a decent game of chess was a really difficult problem. And that meant that a lot of mathematicians were very keen on solving it. Eventually, it was in 1997, IBM built something called Big Blue. Those who were around at the time will remember, because this made newspaper headlines all over the place. It had 500 processors and 215 special function bits added to it. So it wasn't exactly your average office computer. And they tested it by playing chess. The strategy was mostly brute force. If I did this and the opponent did that, and then I did this and the opponent did that, but there are far too many of them to analyze. So what they did was to pre-program it. So just as we learn to play chess, we learn standard openings, and it saves a lot of complicated thought at the beginning of the game, for the first half dozen moves perhaps. And they did exactly the same thing. So all the usual common standard openings were preset as patterns that the system could just recognize and tick a box. In the event, Big Blue, it only beat the world champion by one game. 3 games of the 6 were drawn. Kasparov won 1 and the computer won 2. So it's a pretty marginal result really, but it was hailed at the time, and I remember it well. There was a lot of noise about this. It was hailed as the beginning of intelligent computing. But in reality, it wasn't anything of the sort. It was just a lot of clever number crunching. I don't mean that disparagingly. It was a very important milestone and took a lot of work. Now let's have a look at another game, a game which I doubt that many of you are very familiar with. It's very popular in the Far East. It has a substantial following in Europe and America. It's played on a 19x19 board. It's reckoned to have an average of 211 moves in a game and an average of 200 choices per move, which gives you, theoretically, a total number of playing options of 10 to the power 500, which is reckoned to be bigger than the number of atoms in the universe. So this is not only beyond the capability of Big Blue and or any of its successors. It's just inconceivable that a machine could be built to deal with that, which is why it took so long to crack it. So, understandably, if it looks difficult, there's going to be a bunch of clever people who are determined to crack it. So it wasn't until large AI systems came about that a whole new approach could be adopted to playing the game. And in 2016, Google, as part of their DeepMind project, tested it by playing Go, as you do when you want to test to see if a computer is intelligent. You choose the most difficult game you can find and hope to be the first to crack it. DeepMind, in fact, we'll be talking a little more about that later. It is one of the major players in the development of artificial intelligence systems. So it took 19 years before this computer was developed that could actually beat the world champion, a fellow called Lee Sedol, who's a Korean. In a series of 5 games, the Korean world champion was beaten by 4 games to 1. So it's a pretty decisive victory, and it rattled an awful lot of cages. There was a great deal of excitement in the Far East about this. Probably not so much excitement in UK, although the journal Nature, which you may be aware is one of the leading scientific journals, had a whole series of articles on this in 2016. So in technical circles, it was considered to be a very significant achievement. So to achieve this, the program used 3 of the learning methods. It started with supervised reinforcement learning, where the machine was fed with a whole load, hundreds of historical recorded games which had been digitized. Then it went to self-learning, where 2 versions of itself were set against each other to play each other. So they could just sort of sit there playing game after game after game, and they went through and they then learned from many thousands of games that nobody would have had the time to input to the machines. And finally, it was supplemented with imitation learning. So in Go, as in chess, there are standard opening sequences, which are called joseki. But also, because on a game of Go, you can have half a dozen battles going on in different parts of the board. And each of those battles can be categorized with certain best moves under certain circumstances. So Tsuji and Tsumego are techniques used to win local battles. So they could be pre-programmed with best moves, and that could cut down the amount of analysis that needed to be done. The important thing about this is that the computer was not told how to play the game. It was told, obviously, how to place a stone, and it was told if what it tried to do, because it started off obviously with completely random moves, it was told, yes, you can do that, no, you can't. And it learned from what it was told it could do and what it couldn't do. It learned the game simply by experiment. Just like that robot learned to stand up. It just made random moves, being told whether it was allowed to do them or not, and what the result was. And yet it handled what appeared to be a completely intractable complexity of possibilities. And in this sense, while the Big Blue was hailed as being intelligent, which it wasn't really, it just looked intelligent because it could crunch a lot of numbers that other people hadn't managed before. This is now considered to be truly intelligent because it wasn't even shown what to do. It was just told when it was making a mistake. But there was an elephant in the room. Everybody was shocked at this victory. But the reason why AlphaGo lost one game is actually quite disturbing. It won the game because the human competitor, Lee Sedol, made a mistake. Now, it wasn't a silly mistake. He just made a, shall we say, a non-optimal move. And in a video which recorded the incident, they were playing in a room with a large audience, with press and all sorts of regional champions and everything there. When Lee Sedol made this particular move, there was a gasp from the room, where everybody there thought, what? How could Lee Sedol make that seemingly not silly, but just not very clever move? And it won him the game. And it won him the game because the computer thought it had recognized a pattern, and it didn't, with the effect that the computer responded to that move with its own suboptimal move, and in the end lost the game. And that is disturbing because at this point, I was hoping to show you a 4-minute video which was made of this incident, because I thought you might find it quite interesting, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that. So I shall press on. So, yes, the elephant in the room. We're now going to fast forward to 2023, last year. Since then, AlphaGo, which is the program that beat Lee Sedol, has been improved, and it's generally recognized to be completely unbeatable by human beings. A number of other AI projects have been used to learn the game of Go, and they play to various different standards, but they're all very, very good. But in 2023, a fellow called Kellyn Purina played a tournament using an OpenAI, that's the company, machine, their ChatGPT machine, the one that we can use to generate text and answer exam questions. But they set that up to play Go, as you do. And this fellow Kellyn Purina, who is not a world champion, he won 14 games out of 15. And this is quite remarkable, because you would think that since 2016, everything would get better with the computers, and it did. So how did he win 14 out of 15? He won it because he studied what went wrong in Lee Sedol's game. How did Lee win that one game out of 5? And he discovered that if you play certain poor moves, you can fool the system into making bad moves for itself. So why is this such bad news? Well, it's bad news because we're entering a world where artificial intelligence is being used for very large databases, and we're going to become increasingly dependent on them. The thing that went wrong, I think, was the imitation learning bit, that the machine had learned how to play Go, and it would play Go very well. But because it had an absolutely intractable variety of possibilities to plow through, imitation learning was used. In other words, it was taught about opening sequences and how to win local battles. And mistakes were made, or a mistake was made, and Lee Sedol stumbled across it, and Kellyn Purina actually went into more research to find out how to actually use it to his advantage. So the problem we have is that when you're dealing with very, very big data domains, and you need effectively to cheat the system by giving it what you and I would call rules of thumb, you know, you're told, look, if things get a bit complicated, it'll be pretty safe to do this, that, or the other, to save you a lot of thought. And that, unfortunately, is a necessary part of very big systems, and I think will remain so. So you have here a machine which is essentially superhuman, which now has some clay feet that human beings are putting into it, if you'll excuse the metaphor. And the problem with that is, of course, you may not discover this and for some time after it's been in service, and people have become dependent on it. So what I'd like to do now is just to, I'm just checking the time, right, 5. What I'd like to do now is to just to summarize the failure modes, because these are the things which are going to trip these systems up. The first, and I think the most important failure mode, is like any other IT project, where the people who specify the project do not know enough about what the people at sharp end actually do. And therefore, they specify and design and build a system that the people at the sharp end can't use properly. Now, that is one of the problems that caused this scandal with the post office system. That apart from the thing not being able to add up, it seems, the users have been saying that it just wasn't designed properly to do the things they needed it to do behind the counter, because the people who specified it and designed it just didn't really understand the jobs of the people who were using it. And this happens so often. So that's why I've got that at the top of the list, because I think that is a very common and very serious and very expensive problem. The second, which is in training, where the people training the system don't train it on the right data. So, for example, the London Underground a few years ago had a problem. They put in cameras to recognize villains from police mugshot photographs. And unfortunately, it made mistakes with black people, caused quite a scandal and had to be taken out. And the reason behind that is that it hadn't been trained properly to recognize black people. So just because the system is trained, it doesn't necessarily mean it's trained to cope with the entire scope of data that it's going to have to deal with in service. Data poisoning is also a very real risk, where the system might be trained on unreliable data, public sources, which may be unverified. And there's a lot of material out there. You go into Google and search all sorts of things, and you get all sorts of different opinions on things. And of course, a lot of material published on the internet is commercially biased or politically biased. And so systems can be trained on, shall we say, unreliable information. With imitation learning, as we've seen, a preset pattern where you've got these preset patterns, these shortcuts, if you like, built in, either through ignorance or carelessness, or commercial or even political interest. The people putting these shortcuts into the system may be embodying assumptions that are not valid. And that is the, if you like, the, my opinion, an interpretation of what happened with the Lee Sedol win and the Kellyn Verena win, that someone had put in assumptions that weren't valid. And finally, the designers could embody a backdoor, either knowingly or otherwise, where a system could be corrupted or disabled by someone who knows a trigger, a data pattern that can cause the system to make a mistake or you know, do something wrong, as Kellyn Verena did. So, in my view, there are 5 principal failure modes inherent in artificial intelligence that we're now developing. Briefly now, AI applications, 2 groups as I see it: social and scientific research and generative AI. They overlap to some extent. So we go, I've got 5 categories here. There are others, of course. medical, for example, interpreting scans, assistance with diagnosis, because a machine that can help with medical diagnosis could be trained on vast quantities of case histories, far more than a human doctor could ever come across or be trained in or experience in their lifetime. So in principle, an AI system could be trained to deal with so many more complications than you would expect a normal doctor to cope with. And they can do interventions and so forth. National Institute of Health can give more information on what's happening there. Nuclear research, if you take fusion reactions, for example, very expensive equipment to develop this. The more they can do by using AI to analyze what's going on in the nucleus of atoms and what's happening to materials that are being bombarded with the neutrons, the less physical experimentation they need to do and the faster they can develop the program, but also for various other things, safety analysis and so forth. The International Atomic Energy Authority has got a lot more information on that. Conservation, the World Wildlife Fund publishes some information. They're interested in, for example, animal populations, migration habits, changes in habitat, and so forth. So, I mean, just for example, aerial photography. You take an aerial photograph, you need to recognize the animals that are in it, and it might not be very easy. And you see, and an expert will say, "Oh yes, that's a tiger there," or something else. So, and an AI analyzer can be as reliable as a human expert in identifying what it's looking at, and therefore helping to keep count of things and where they are. As I say, the World Wildlife Fund is interested in that. The social side, AI systems can be used to analyze you and effectively profile you. Just an interesting point that this I don't think involved AI, but last year some friends of mine, they had a dog and the dog got old and died, and they came to me. They're not internet savvy. They came to me and said, "Can you help us find another dog through a rescue centre?" So I went into Google and I looked up some rescue centres, made a note of names, addresses and phone numbers, passed it on, and I gave it no more thought. 2 days later, my Facebook stream, which has sponsored advertising in it, was full of advertising for dog rescue centres and veterinary services. So how did Facebook know that I'd been online in Google looking for dog rescue centres? So it just shows that absolutely everything you do, and the social media, you know, whether or not you think it's private, is actually available for commercial use. And I think that that is going to become a bigger and bigger problem, because a lot of people aren't really very careful about what they say in their social media, and they could be profiled, and all sorts of things can happen when big companies start using AI to profile their customers to determine what services they can have and so forth. So I'm not going to cover generative AI today because it is a very big subject, and even today I've been reading articles about all sorts of problems that are coming out of the woodwork. They're functional problems, they're user problems, even legal problems. So what I propose to do is to leave the generative AI for a future session, and we can cover that in more detail, and I'll have a lot more useful information by then. But quickly, if I may, I'd like to talk about NVIDIA's foundation model. You can look at their website yourself if you want. And when you buy an office computer now, you buy a box, and in that box is some hardware with memory and computer and so forth. It comes with an operating system, and it's able to communicate on the internet and through Bluetooth and so forth. You then add bits and pieces that you want. So for example, you can add a CAD software or a vertical market accounting system or something. NVIDIA which used to just produce graphics cards, they're now producing foundation model AI systems. And a foundation model is the AI equivalent of your computer box. But it's a lot more than that. It is an AI system that's already been trained with text, images, to recognize and generate speech. And that's all been, it's not only an AI system in there electronically, it's actually been trained to process this information. That then gets sold as a sort of a grey box, and then you then adapt it, which is that little grey box, to use in whatever your particular task area is. So I've looked here at sentiment analysis, the little green one on the right. Now that can be either of two things. As managers, sentiment analysis might be, what do your customers think about you, or what do your suppliers think about you, and you can analyze that by conventional means. But if you're a stock market trader, a fund manager, sentiment means something entirely different. Sentiment is something that you use to determine where other people are going to find certain shares valuable or not. So certain clues, like for example, if there's a takeover pending, or a chief executive is changing, or a company's suddenly got a massive contract in the Middle East, then you can guess that the shares of that company are going to become more valuable. So you buy them before the price goes up. But there are so many other factors that what they're doing now, stock market traders, they're using AI, they're feeding it masses of historical data, which has all been digitized, on the circumstances, and of course the foundation model can read all the news articles, so it can actually look at all the stuff that the stock market traders never have time to read properly, and it can read them all properly and generate patterns and say, well, these news articles in combination with this, that, and the other is generally followed with a rise or a fall in the shares. So it can look far more deeply. But what you need to do as an adaptation for this market is you need it to look at subscription-only journals, things that you have to pay to read, which stock market traders would, of course. So what they would have to do is to take the foundation model, they would then have to add to it the ability to read subscription journals, which aren't available to members of the public, and train it to recognize the patterns that it sees in them. And then they can use that together with obviously historical records of share prices and so forth. So like playing Go, the AI can in that area match and generally can probably quite easily improve on human behavior, because like medical diagnosis, if it has access to vast quantities of historical records, it can have access to so much more information than a human being could process in their own or even several other lifetimes. So very briefly now to finish, the UK AI market presently worth about nearly 17 billion. So by 2035, give it 10 years, nearly 804 billion. They reckon 68% of large companies and 33% of medium and 15% of small companies are using AI in one form or another. I'm a little bit skeptical about 15% of small companies. It may be they're using it, but they don't know they're using it. They might be using a chatbot or something and don't realize there's AI powering it. Most common, data management and analysis, natural language processing, of course, because that is where you have this GPT, this generative pre-trained transformer, is able to read newspapers and journals and websites and actually make sense of what it's reading and correlate that with other facts and figures that it gets to know about. Machine learning, AI hardware, that's a big development. The graphics processor units, GPUs, that NVIDIA used to produce now they're producing them really as special hardware for improving the capacity of what they call deep learning AI machines. Image process and generation we hear about. And so that really finishes really what I came to talk about. A lot of these things are problematic, technically, legally, socially, and I hope that on a future occasion I shall be invited back and I shall be able to give you a talk and let you know what's happening there. So thank you very much for listening. You've been very patient. I hope you haven't all run away. And if there's time, I would be very pleased to answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. That's a very informative talk and a great update on AI. And yeah, I'm sure we'll have you back again. Alan McBain usually deals with the questions. I don't know whether anybody has got a question that they'd like to put to Dr. Peter Grossi. But if you have got a question, then we're quite prepared to hear it. And I'm sure Peter will try his best to answer it for you.
I shall do my best.
There's a couple of questions in the Q&A part of this Teams window from Ian Dalling, who's in the call, and we asked earlier, how can you validate large AI applications beyond simple definable games, which are critical to major risks? Real life is a very complicated game. How do you know when to apply the precautionary principle?
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, that's that is an interesting question. It's all down to training, because there's no inbuilt programming in an AI system. It's all down to training. So if you want a system you can trust, you have to make quite sure that it's been trained with not only the required scope of information, so that, you know, when you ask it to do something, it's actually been exposed to the information it needs to understand and answer the question. But you also need to know that it hasn't been, well, I won't say tampered with, but, you know, where people, because as you imply, these machines are used for very large data sets, very complicated situations, and therefore rules of thumb tend to get built in order to help it cope with the volume. And those rules of thumb are not necessarily accurate. So the problem arises, how do you know that it is reliable? And the answer is, I won't say you don't, but it is not straightforward. It's not like a deterministic, you know, conventional programming, which is deterministic. You feed it certain patterns and you can check whether it's got the right answer or not. The other thing about standard programming technique is that you can break down a system into a succession or a cascade of processes, each of which does part of the problem, if you like, and passes it on. And it's the same with hardware production, equipment production. You have a production line where you take components, you make minor assemblies, they become major assemblies, and then into the final product. You make sure you check each stage to make sure that the process there is reliable, so you don't find out that something's wrong at the end, when in fact it's actually gone wrong near the beginning. And this is standard quality systems practice. You can't do that with AI. You can't say to AI, well, how did you get that answer? It can't tell you. It can only just say, well, you know, according to the patterns that I'm familiar with, what you've just given me has the following answer. And that is a big problem. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but and that's really why it's such a good question, because I don't think there really is an answer to it at the moment. Hopefully, when I get on to generative AI, and I will have read rather more articles, because there's a lot of activity going on discussing these problems. that hopefully next time when I speak, I shall have some more information about how people are actually dealing with them.
Thank you. Thank you. Ian also asked a couple more questions. Ian, feel free to unmute yourself if you wanted to have more of a conversation around this. But I can go ahead and just read out the questions you put in the chat.
Okay.
So the second one was, it seems AI is just learning by exhaustion. Are AI systems dumb in the sense that they don't understand their output as a human would?
So you're saying that AI systems don't understand their output?
Don't know if you want to clarify on that one, Ian, or if I should move on to the other one.
The word understanding is difficult to clarify. All you can do is to say is an AI system, when it's presented with a pattern, it will compare with what is already known, just as we do. You know, people will something will happen and you can say, oh, I've been through this before, I know what to do. So understanding is a difficult concept in AI because really all it's doing is recognizing patterns. The problem is when it thinks it recognizes a pattern that it doesn't actually recognize because it's not been properly trained or it's not a big enough model to understand the vast volume of alternatives it's supposed to be considering.
Yeah.
So that's about.
Can I just say something, Peter? Can you hear me? I've unmuted myself. Yeah, I think one of the difficulties as we go forward is the language we use. I mean, and I've got colleagues in the area of IT and whatever, and one of them is very strong to me. He said it's the worst thing we ever did, calling it AI, calling it intelligence, because it isn't not in the sense of which we use in intelligence, you know, for a human. So certainly, I mean, and I've heard, I've watched YouTube, some of the people doing the latest research, and they're actually sort of saying we are experiencing consciousness. And I think if I remember one of the ex-Google guys who worked on this, and he absolutely believes this. Now, other people take a contrary view. So I think one of the difficulties as we move forward in using AI and trying to understand it is the language. We almost need to define very carefully what we mean by intelligence and what we don't. And certainly there's no way that AI has any emotional intelligence. And most people would argue there isn't consciousness there. Now, I have another question that I'll ask at the same time because it's very much sort of related. And that is currently we have no credible theories of how physical matter becomes conscious. And this has been sought now for centuries. Now, we do have contrary views coming from Eastern philosophies who turn the thing round. But I'm saying we've sort of got very muddy waters for trying to understand AI, and AI is almost like just a collective term for a lot of things, in so much as it's necessary now to categorize the different aspects of AI, which you've done very well, Peter. So that was just the general point I'm sort of saying. It's going to be very difficult for politicians to sort of make policy because we don't have the sort of language for discussing AI. Like if you sort of look at Parliament and listen to it, you'll find that they're nearly all lawyers, and the lawyers need the right language. And I think that's what we're missing.
I think this is a distraction. I think this is a distraction. Artificial intelligence doesn't pretend to be emotional. It doesn't pretend to be political. And I think to try and conflate,
but some people say it's intelligent.
I think what we call artificial intelligence, the emphasis is on the word artificial. It does what appears to be intelligent in the sense that it learns for itself rather than having to be told blow by blow what to do, which is like us in a way. but we have to understand that it is a machine that learns patterns and responds to patterns, and that is the beginning and end of what it does. So to now say, let's talk about this in terms of emotional concepts, it just doesn't apply. It's not an argument that I think arises. We just got to say, well, it doesn't feature in that scope of argument. It's something different.
But some people,
in a sense,
but
it's
some
mechanical.
some people are saying it does. You see, and
Well,
I think
they shouldn't.
oh,
I
no,
think they're conflating this.
I totally agree. I
No,
totally
I think
agree. And
we
that
have to
all I'm that's
accept it.
just I'm making that point. You know,
Yes, I think we have to accept it for what it is, and what it
managing.
is not an animal. It is not human. It is a machine, and I think we have to accept it for what it is. It recognizes patterns and responds accordingly. If we want to attach emotion to it, that's our problem.
Totally agree. I totally agree, Peter. But the point I'm making is, as we go forward and trying to manage it, it's not everybody who would see it like we do, and they certainly don't. And even some of the leading people in AI are talking about it differently, and I think that is going to be a problem for policymakers. Anyway, I won't go on any more about it, but I think you'll see it coming. Well, I've already seen it, so I think you'll see more of it. It's not just the technical machine issue, in my view.
There's just a point I'd like to add here, that I'm sure somewhere or another there can be built into it, Peter, some sort of self-regulation of best practice. If there is, some sort of system like that that can be built into it, it will have sort of self-correct itself and give itself, sort of a focus on excellence in doing the right thing in every situation. I'm sure something like that could be built into it,
I think that is an interesting argument, because with conventional systems, best practice, or good, let's call it good quality and quality assurance. How do you know this is as good as it's claimed to be? How do you know that what it's going to tell you is reliable? And that is a very difficult question with AI, because with normal systems, you can break down the process by which it gets you an answer, and you can validate the individual parts of the process and thereby gain confidence in the result at the end. But you can't do that with AI. But what you can do, however, is to validate the way it's been trained. So if I were a quality assurance person, which I am no longer, but if I were a quality assurance professional and I were asked to quality assure an AI system for a particular purpose, I would scrape back. I wouldn't just see or show me what it does and I'll tick the box if I think it's right, sort of thing, because if it's dealing with innumerable possibilities, you can't check every one. With a deterministic system, you can, because you can break it down and see the bits work. But so what can you do? What you can do is to check the way it's been trained. Now, in my last talk, I talked a little bit about how it converges on an answer, that it will start by producing random outputs, and as you train it, it will gradually more and more often get the right answer. And there's a sort of a learning curve, just there is with people, except it's a different shape. And so as a quality assurance expert, if you were to go back over the training records, you should be able to check that it has converged on better and better answers, and that there is still a certain probability of it coming up with the wrong answer. Because it's not deterministic, you see, it's not like an accounting system where the number at the bottom is either calculated correctly or not. In the end, very often this is an opinion. You show it a picture of someone and it will say whether it thinks it recognizes it, but it won't say 100%. It'll say, I think, 99% I think it's person A, and maybe 5% I think it might be person B, sort of thing.
Just a point.
So we have this complication, and I think the training is the clue to quality assurance.
It's just a point I'd like to make here now. When you think of a person going for their driving test, they have to meet certain criteria. If with AI development, if it's whatever it's developing, whatever area, there should be some sort of built-in self-evaluation and testing to prove that it's gained a certain amount of sort of competence in getting to that standard, like a series of tests that it has to comply with. Unless it can comply with the standards of that compliance, then it has to go through more training. It can have its own built-in training process, an evaluation.
Yes, I think you're right. I think the parallel here is coursework. I think if you evaluate an AI system by its training records, it's a bit like evaluating a student's performance through coursework.
Yeah.
And when you come to the end, then you see, if you're talking about a driving test, that's okay. That's pretty straightforward. An AI machine, let's say a driverless car, you could say, right, drive down here, 3-point. Don't do 3-point. They don't call them even 3-point turns anymore, do they? Turn around in the road without hitting anything, I think, is the correct description nowadays. But I think if you were to take a driverless car, it's not enough to say drive down the road and see if you can get from A to B without hitting anything. That wouldn't be an effective test, because it's not testing the scope of possibilities that machine is supposed to deal with. Like the pedestrian that's about to jump in the road in front of them. Matter of fact, when I took my driving test in Eastbourne, 3 people tried to commit suicide by jumping in front of them. So I had to do 3 genuine emergency stops. And would you believe it? The examiner still insisted in doing one his own way as well, having got his nose bent 3 times on the windscreen because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. But no, so Derek, if I may, getting to your point, I think yes, a test at the end isn't enough, because in the general rule, the AI system will be expected to cope with so many possibilities that a simple test isn't going to see whether it can cope with them all. So the only way to do this is through effectively the equivalent of coursework. What happened during its training? What training records have you got? How reliable it is it at dealing with certain things?
Yeah. Okay, Pete, that's great. I think we're running out of time now, Lisa. So we'll have to call it a day, but it's been very interesting, Peter. I'm sure everybody's enjoyed it, and it's enlightened us, and we've enjoyed what's been going on. So I'd just like to put us over to Carl, because Carl has got some announcements for us. Carl?
Yeah, thanks very much, Derek. And yeah, great. Thanks very much, Peter. That's an excellent talk you've given there, and the questions from Ian as well. Just to say that we've got some provisionally arranged events coming up, and the next one that we've got provisionally arranged for Wednesday, the April 24th. And that's Sharon Shuttler, who's given us a lot of interesting talks. She's going to discuss about releasing our competitive edge. That's provisionally arranged for that date. We're looking at other dates as well for the programme at the moment as a committee, and we'll let you know about those. Also, as usual, we've provisionally booked in July our summer conference, where we talk about changes to management system standards, the quality standards, all the ISO standards and things. So we'll have speakers hopefully arranged for that in July sometime. And just to finish on other things that we also have, you should be able to get CPD confirmation emails from the CQI for attending this event. Lisa, do they need to message you or message the Wales branches for that?
They can message us, or they can go straight to you. I'm just putting the email address to request CPD certificates in the chat. branches@quality.org.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much for that. And also, just to mention that if anyone would like to become a member of the Wales Branch CQI IRC committee, they could contact me as well on that, and we'll give you the details about joining us. And also that we actually run the quality, or have in place, a Quality Foundation Award scheme for students studying quality courses and modules at the University of South Wales, and that's overseen by Professor Gareth Thomas. And if you need any more information or need a presentation, please contact Professor Gareth Thomas, who's on our committee as well. You can send me details. My contact details are Carl, that's Karl Mrozek, that's MROSEK @alcumus, alcumus.com if you need to. Okay, thanks. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay, I'd just like to thank everybody for participating tonight, especially Dr. Peter Grossi for an excellent and enlightening talk, and for everybody else helping, especially for Lisa and Carl and Gavin, who've worked over the last couple of weeks with Peter to get us up and running with Microsoft Rooms. So I think it's worked out fine tonight. So I'd just like to give everybody a big thank you, and for those who have attended, for especially the facilitators.